Hey guys, in this video we're going to be talking about some simple steps that will help you get started in using the manual modes and the creative modes of your camera. Most people are very intimidated by the creative and manual modes that their camera offers, and oftentimes will just simply leave the camera in auto and let it decide the settings that it thinks it's necessary for the particular photos. But if you really want to take your photography to the next step, take a little time and learn how to use some of those creative modes of your camera, and that's what we're going to talk about in this video. I'm going to show you some basic steps that will help you get started in using the creative and full manual modes. The best way to start learning how to use the creative modes of your camera is simply take some time, set up your camera, and take shots playing around with the different settings. One of the first things we're going to do is to take a photo using the full auto mode and look at how the camera interprets the available light. We're going to get an idea of where to start from that. Our camera is set up on the tripod, and the first thing that we're going to do is take a photograph using our full auto mode. We will be able to get a lot of information about the exposure of that photograph from our camera. If you press the preview button on your camera and then press the info button and scroll through till you get to the histograph, you will see that your camera can tell you a lot of information about the shot that you just took. It tells you that for this particular shot that our shutter speed was 1/100th of a second and our f-stop was 5.6. The ISO was at 400. If we're to take these values and enter them into the camera when we're in manual mode, our exposure should be exactly the same. I've entered those values into the camera, and now we are going to take a follow-up shot. If we look at the histogram for this particular shot and compare it to the other one, you will see that our exposures are fairly close. Of course, we're in the late afternoon here. The light is rapidly changing, so there will be just a little bit of a difference in these exposures. The last shot that we took, we used the full manual mode, copying the settings that the camera interpreted on its own. We can adjust those settings up or down depending on what we want the exposure to do, depending on what we want to do with the depth of field, and really broaden out the way that a photo can look. The exposure of a photograph consists of three elements: the ISO, which is the sensitivity of your camera to the light; the shutter speed, which is how long the shutter and the sensor is exposed to that light; as well as the f-stop, or the amount of light that your lens will bring in to the sensor. I'll tell you a little bit about the ratio of the three elements of exposure. I've left my camera in full manual mode. I've left the shutter speed at 1/100th of a second, and I've also left the ISO at 400. The only thing that I've changed has been my aperture. The f-stop, I've taken it down to f11. And let's take a photograph and see how that affects the shot. You can see that this image is much darker than the one before. Here is the shot before, when we had our camera in full manual mode and just copied the settings from the automatic exposure that we took earlier. The exposure with the f-stop down at f11 is much darker. Now, if we wanted to balance that out, we're either going to have to leave our shutter speed open longer, or we're going to have to turn up the sensitivity of the ISO in our camera. What I've done now to balance out where we brought our f-stop down to f11 is I have opened up the shutter speed to 1/25th of a second. Since we are on a tripod, there shouldn't be any movement in the photograph. And let's take a shot and see how that does. You can see at 1/25th of a second with that f-stop of 11 that we have brightened the photograph back up. Here's the photograph with f-stop of 11 and the shutter speed at 1/100th of a second. You can see it's much darker. There are going to be times that you simply are not going to be able to leave that shutter open much longer, especially when you are in a situation where there's low light and where you're trying to really capture a still shot without having any blurring in it. Your other alternative there is to bump up the ISO, or the sensitivity of your camera to the light. That way you will be able to have a faster shutter speed and still get the correct exposure on your camera. We've set our shutter speed back to 1/100th of a second, and our f-stop is still at f11. What we're going to do now to compensate for the lack of light is we're going to bump up our ISO. And we're going to see how well that does in bringing our exposure back up to the level that we need it to be. It's getting dark out here, so I'm actually going to go up to about 2500 ISO. And now all we're going to do is take another shot and compare that to our previous exposures. Okay, here is the shot taken with the f-stop of 11, the shutter speed at 100, and the ISO is bumped up to 2500. Now let's compare some of the photos that we've taken. This photo is the one we took in manual mode, where we had our f-stop at 5.6, our shutter speed was 1/100th of a second, and our ISO was at 400. If we scroll through our images, we will see that when we dropped our f-stop down to an f11, the photograph got much darker. We left our shutter speed the same, and we left our ISO the same. If we scroll on through, we will see that raising that shutter speed and allowing it to stay open longer at 1/25th of a second, our exposure lightened back up. Now then, another example, when we go over here to the image we took with our shutter speed at 1/100th of a second, our f-stop at f11, and our ISO raised up to 2500, we can see that the exposure on it is at a broader level as well. You need to always remember that there is a trade-off in adjusting your exposure. If you are going to use a longer shutter speed, you run the risk of adding blur to your photograph. If you are going to use a higher ISO, you are going to run the risk of adding grain into the image. So there is a trade-off in everything that you do. However, with enough practice and just having some fun with this, you will learn some neat tricks that are going to make your photographs just amazing. You can also use the shutter priority mode in your camera, where you will adjust your shutter speed, and then your camera will calculate what it thinks the f-stop should be to get the exposure correct. There's also the aperture priority mode, which will allow you to set your f-stop where you want it to be, and then the camera will calculate what it thinks the shutter speed needs to be for correct exposure. Thanks for watching the video. I hope it's helpful to you. I hope that it gives you encouragement to go out there with your camera, switch it to manual mode, and start playing around with the settings. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. Join me on Facebook, drop me a comment, and thanks for your time.